Hello, my name is Dr. Gary Simmons, and this is the conclusion of the four-part series, An Inconvenient Truth About Minister-centric Ministry. You know, storytelling is one of the oldest forms of psychotherapy, and whenever we come together to tell stories, we create experiences. We deepen not only our appreciation, but also we can also experience a rewounding or a re-traumatization of any past hurt. But in the case study that you watched or listened to represents a way in which we can have insight into the dynamic of ministry that can only appear to us as we look at ministry over time and look at the impact of the comings and goings of ministers over time and the individual centers and communities and their struggle to recover from that and to move on. And so this segment is going to continue to look at the dynamic of community and organization as it lives in the context of moving from one ministerial era to another. And this is just a snapshot with respect to what's going on in our New Thought movement, but I think it's indicative of the challenge that we must address if we're to move our ministry dynamic into second tier, into mission-centric ministry practice. What you've experienced as a case study was called a Making Peace with the Past process. This was a process that I created after I participated in the Mennonite Mediation Skills Institute training when I was a regional representative of the South Central Unity Churches Association. And suffice to say that that process has evolved, and after I left the role as Director of Peacemaking Services, it evolved and became something else under Stephanie Sy and then later under Tony Boehm. I'm wanting to present this material in a slightly different context, not in the context of healing and reconciliation, but in the context of transitioning from minister-centric to mission-centric ministry. And so when we explore the nuances of the story that you heard in the case study, I'm wanting to begin to share information about the insights that are possible when we look at a ministry's experience over time. And in the course of the process itself, facilitating a genogram activity, one of the important messages that is conveyed to the participants is that there are three aims to the genogram activity. And the first aim is that we're here to identify the unconscious patterns that perpetuate a legacy of unresolved issues. So whatever is going on that's a part of the ministry's pain body, we're here to identify that. We're here to get in touch with what that energy is. The second aim is to see those patterns as the unintended consequence of the way in which we do ministry. And then finally, the third aim is to create the church's shadow card and to be able to have a sense of the underlying issues and what they represent. And in effect, the genogram activity is putting the ministry through a Q process. And so rather than this being an intervention, which it was in the context of the case study, I will present aspects of that case study in the context of the intervention that this ministry received. But I'm mostly going to be pointing my comments towards the ultimate aim of understanding why we look at the case study is to see that all of our interventions, everything that this ministry engaged with respect to the services and programs that the parent organization could provide, was insufficient to alter the established patterns of that ministry. Even though there was a healing and reconciliation process, the timeline of that ministry continued to have its roller coaster appearance. So before I speak specifically to the case study that you were introduced to, I want to talk a little bit about the storytelling process. First of all, the genogram activity, or the making peace with the past, or healing your past and creating a new future, is a highly structured process. But with respect to telling the church's story, or any story, there are certain fundamental aspects of the storytelling process that are important. And so part of the genogram activity is all about identifying what the past has been like, so that we can get into understanding the dynamics that are currently affecting what's happening in the present day circumstance. And so we begin the storytelling process by first identifying the eras that are associated with the tenure of the spiritual leader. I mean, that makes sense. When you're telling a story, you begin with the principal characters of the story. And then we would look at the history of the church in the context of those individual eras. And in addition to identifying the ministerial leaders or lack thereof, the transition processes, or whatever took place in the course of this ministry's journey in the case study, we're also going to look at the things that happened that were great for the community, that produced a sense of pride or accomplishment. We're also going to look at the sorries, the regrets, the things that happened within the ministry's experience that were disappointments or even traumatic. And we're also going to look at the range, the felt sense of what it meant to move from one era to the next, what I describe as a transition range, from 1 to 10. 1 being it was no big deal at all, and 10 being it was very traumatic. And then we're going to discern what might be the unresolved issues associated with each specific era. Now, as a facilitator, I'm facilitating the conversation as opposed to trying to influence how the content is generated. But my role also includes creating a safe place for people to share their experience without having to defend their perspective or their point of view. And so part of the ground rules of the entire storytelling process is important. And I don't have time to go into the specifics in this segment, but suffice it to say that the role of the facilitator of this process also will reframe whatever comments might be barbed or otherwise unskillfully shared that might trigger someone else who had perhaps a different experience, maybe even an opposite experience, necessitating their having to propose their perspective in defense. And so if we can have an opportunity for competing perspectives to coexist without feeling the need to defend oneself, then not only can we tell our story, but we can share what our experience was without feeling that it has to be a certain way in order to be acceptable or okay to folks. And so that's in part the skill of the facilitator, to be able to manage that aspect of the storytelling process. Another important point is that the story is not about trying to find out what happened, but it's more about trying to find out what people are carrying with them that's still affecting how they're being in their experience of ministry. And so the process itself is one in which, while we tell the story, the context of the storytelling process is really about, we're not trying to find out what happened, we're trying to find out what people are carrying within their hearts with respect to their experience of what has happened in their experience. And so that's important to note. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to very quickly run through the 9 eras that were represented in that case study, so that you can have a sense of what the genogram activity, or the making peace of the past, or the healing your past and creating a new future process is about. Now, there are variations in many ways depending upon the facilitator, so this is not a representative of any of those processes, but it's going to point to a different process that I've created called the genogram activity, that is as if putting the community, the organization, through a Q process experience. So the first era, Mildred Wiseman, who founded the church, who started the church, obviously is an important one to consider. And as you can see in this slide, I've listed the prouds and the sorries and the unresolved issues. Now, these unresolved issues aren't things that I've come up with. These are things that the community identifies in the course of their telling the story of the church. Now, only the people who are in the room who've actually had the experience of being there with Ms. Wiseman can speak to that experience, because we're not here to find out what happened, and so we're not collecting hearsay or what third-party information or resources tell us about what's happened. We're really here about how what has happened has affected people. And so to have a person tell their story, what has happened to them, what they're proud of, what they regret, and what they see as what's missing or broken or not working, that's the important point of this process. And that helps shift the energy around the past as well. And then there's a transition, of course, and since their first minister passed away, it was very difficult, but it wasn't all of a sudden so much, and so there was time. It's not like someone died of a heart attack on the way to the office, and it's a total shock to everybody. Now, in the second era, but within 45 days, Reverend Michael Rock was hired. And as you can see, the prouds and the sorries, once again, the unresolved issues, and how the experience of that individual's tenure was. Now, in the third era, there was no interim process, and so they went 18 months without a minister. And we still look at that because they're still having their experience in ministry. They still have their accomplishments and their regrets. The fourth era, Reverend Bob and Ellen Day, of course, was a tremendous growth period for this ministry. And so we can see, in the sense of this particular era, that and knowing that Reverend Bob's going to die, just how impactful their experience is in this context. And with Reverend Ellen so grief-stricken and separating herself from all contact with the community, we can understand how wounding this era was. But there's a kind of rebound effect, isn't there? It seems like we move from being really sad to let's try something new. Let's do something different. And so Richard Drake was hired, and of course things picked up, and there was movement and activities and growth, but stuff happened. So in the sixth era, with Reverend Candace Brown as an interim minister coming in, we first find now the first effort for this ministry in its entire lifetime to participate in services that are for the purpose of helping the congregation, the community, recover from its experience in the past. But as you saw in this, while the agreement was that she would stay a year, her time was short-lived. And now with the seventh era, with Reverend Rhonda, who in that era, she brought on board some of the services from the parent organization. There was conflict, so she brought in conflict transformation support. And she got board training, and they did other things that brought into the organization more structure, more complexity, more accountability. And this is important because we expect that these interventions are going to help things. But what we don't necessarily count on or anticipate is that under the best of circumstances, the unexpected can happen. And when that occurs, when the unexpected happens, and if the unexpected has been a part of the patterns in the church, it can be traumatizing, as it was for this ministry. And so the eighth era is another example of what could be described as a rebound effect. In other words, that being so grief-stricken, we move towards hiring somebody that's going to free us from our sadness. And here's Reverend Ian, who brings all kinds of new things, rituals, and activities that bring people together in new ways. But the problem is, it's just too different than what they're used to. And so that relationship ends rather quickly. Then finally, in the ninth era, which represents for this ministry in the context of the case study, its present day, we have Reverend Betty now, in interestingly enough, struggling with her board of trustees, being criticized much in the same way. And so here we have now Reverend Betty calling for making peace of the past process, because she senses that what's going on for her is a part of a legacy that she's inherited. And so the next aspect of this conversation is to describe what happened in that Making Peace of the Past process, which is a process that I facilitated. And so before I begin to be in that conversation, I want to give you an example of what the process looks like with respect to taking in and down the data. And so typically it's done on flip charts, and as you can see by this example, this is not the example from the case study. This is an example from the genogram activity that I did at Unity Spiritual Center in Spokane. And I'll talk a little bit more about our process at our ministry with them. But suffice to say that what got produced based upon the information that you saw in the slides that I presented, the documentation, the prouds, the sorries, etc., is represented by this master document where all of that information, all that data is archived, is saved. And then it can be studied. And so in part that's what I'm wanting us to do, is to actually look and study at what's going on in our New Thought movement over time, because no one has ever done this before, and it's important that we take a look and see what's happening, as this is just one example, but yet we can sense that it is likely very universal. So what I've done now in this next graph is to map out that the entire 36-year history of that case study over time, identifying in the graph the attendance fluctuations as well as the specific eras associated with each of those spiritual leaders or lack thereof, as well as color-coded these particular eras in the context of blue being uplifting and red being traumatic and difficult, and green being a kind of kind of neutral piece there. So as you can look at this, you can see that there were 4 uplifting eras and 3 very traumatic eras, and a couple of just speed bumps, so to speak. And it just gives you a felt sense of what's happening. And if we would extend this timeline into the future, it would still look like this. It would still have times when it was great and things were awesome, and it'd have times of difficulty and challenge. And so it's our never-ending story. And it's important that we understand that until we really look and study at what we're creating, we are creating this dynamic. It's not something that's happening to us. It's something that's created out of how we be doing our ministry. And so now what I'm wanting to share are the insights that this community, the participants in that particular Making Peace of the Past process, as they looked at their entire history, their entire story, I asked the question, what do you notice? What is your story trying to tell you about what needs to shift in order for you to be free from your past? And so here's what they noticed. They noticed that 2 ministers died on the job. It seems like that in their culture, that dying is a part of their job description. In other words, it's part of the job description to die on the job if you're going to be a minister here, is what they said. And this was an apt observation because it led them to understand what they were doing in the context of the board being worried about money and worried about stuff, wanting the ministers to work harder. And so they could see, wow, we have helped contribute to the very hurts that we're experiencing right now. And that was an aha that was really powerful for them. The next thing that they noticed is that there were patterns of distrust throughout the ministry. There was distrust between the congregation and the board, between the board and the minister, and the minister and the board and Unity Worldwide and Unity School. There was distrust everywhere, and they saw that. They saw that there was very little partnership in the entire organization. So they also noticed that their congregational identity was so embedded in who the minister was that it was almost as if the minister was the parent. And so that was a great insight for them to have. And when they said parent, they said for better or for worse. So in other words, sometimes it felt pretty good to be taken care of, but other times it felt really, really awful when the parent was not functioning. And then there was also a sense that they did not know themselves independent of who the minister was. They also noticed that the board's role had evolved similar to what happens in family systems when children must take care of their parents, either because of illness or addiction or abandonment. 2 ministers died, 2 ministers in ministerial misconduct. And so what's a board to do but to become a protector, a defender of the ministry, and if necessary, an adversary to the minister. So there's a lot of things that we could say about what's gone on in these 36 years that could have contributed or even exacerbated what has happened in this ministry's journey. I want to make one thing very, very clear at this point. No ministry leader, no congregant, no board member signs up to participate in drama or betrayal or disappointment. And so we need to understand and have great compassion for the unfortunate consequences of what has happened because of this particular paradigm of ministry. Our ministry practice, the way in which our institution conducts itself, has created emotional and spiritual baggage with respect to the way in which we do ministry. And it's important for us to understand that because we carry wounds and hurts that are connected to people and experiences. But if those people and those experiences were also unwilling participants, in a sense, or sort of brought together because of the nature of this ministry practice and the dynamics that are just a part of the business that we're in, so to speak, there needs to be a better way. There must be a better way. And so as we've seen in this storytelling process, when we look at, over time, the experience of ministry and the comings and goings of their spiritual leader, it is not without impact. And so in spite of the interventions that were available at the time, in spite of interim ministry or transition ministry services, in spite of conflict transformation or making peace with the past, or healing the past and creating a new future, within our movement, within our New Thought movement, this legacy of each era inheriting the unintended consequences or unresolved issues of the previous era is the way it works. It's the reason why this particular ministry practice is unsustainable. And so what if we were to tell our ministry story, not in the context of who the minister is and what our accomplishments and prouds and sorrows and unresolved issues are all about in that relationship, but what would happen if we were to tell the story in the context of our efforts to fulfill our mission? What if that becomes the context around which we identify our prouds and our sorrows and our issues, and begin to look at each era in the context of what our purpose was and our efforts to fulfill it? So ultimately, our movement towards a emerging paradigm of ministry needs to take into consideration that we still have stories to tell, and part of our journey will be filled with accomplishments as well as areas where we fell short, and therefore we carry with us some regrets over our experience. But when our stories are about how we were together in terms of our effort to fulfill our purpose, it's quite different than when our story is about the comings and goings of our spiritual leader and how we have been impacted by that. So we're going to begin this next year with our church here at Unity Spiritual Center in Spokane, with every year at each annual membership meeting to begin to map our journey into mission-centric ministry. And so instead of looking at each individual year or over our tenure and map the prouds and sorries as a continuing, ongoing, never-ending story and legacy for the next ministers to inherit, we're going to begin something quite different. We're going to begin doing the genogram activity, and this time telling the story with respect to each era as defined by our mission. So our mission statement at Unity Spiritual Center is transforming lives and inspiring people to make a positive difference in their world. And so we'll begin each annual meeting with an identification of our prouds and our regrets. And each year, while we still are in this intention to transform lives, we will continue with this story and check in to see how we're doing. But this is about our efforts, about our experience as a community. It doesn't differentiate between who the minister is or what's happened in our church, but rather our effort to bring forth this intention to transform lives and inspiring people to make a positive difference in their world. And so it begins with our stories. And so until we create an activity and the stories behind what's happening in our effort to transform lives and create a world that works for everybody, absent of those stories, we're just affirming a purpose and not necessarily aligned with the effort to move it forward. But I'm suggesting that if we are to be relevant in the future, if we are to be sustainable as a movement, that we have to look beyond our own mental models with respect to how ministry should be. We should align with the emerging technologies and the emerging principles that help us enter into second-tier consciousness and imperatives. So over the course of these video segments, I've talked about the unintended consequences of minister-centric ministry. I'm not wanting anybody to think that I'm passing judgment on this particular ministry practice. I'm wanting us to just have a clarity with respect to what are the challenges of our current ministry practice and integrating that into the energies and emerging trends of our current times. And as we look around us and see that the world is changing, and as we look at evolutionary principles and where we're headed in this evolutionary process, we're moving to greater interconnection. We're moving towards inner being. We're moving towards interconnection. We're moving towards and away from a paradigm of separation, of predict and control. And in order for us to align with these emerging energies and strategies, we have to be willing to open ourselves to change and to evolve beyond our yesterday selves.